es immer noch
Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Has China finally arrived in every sense of the word on the world stage? It was at the epicenter of the most recent global financial turbulence. Thus, when something happens to the Chinese economy, it is immediately felt around the world. And China is on track to be the lender of last resort, replacing the U.S. and the IMF. Can the West seriously contain China? To Crosstalk China, I'm joined by my guest, Harry Kazianis in Washington. He is the executive editor of The National Interest and a senior fellow for defense policy at the Center for the National Interest. In Cambridge, we have Richard Cooper. He is a professor of economics at Harvard University. And here in Moscow, we cross to Eric Krauss. He is an independent political risk analyst. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. And in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Harry, if I can go to you first in Washington, D.C. I mean, I suppose we've been watching the rise of China for a long time, at least for maybe like last 2 decades. But as I said in my introduction, you know, a lot of the dots are being connected. Has China finally arrived in every sense of the word? Go ahead.
Oh, China has arrived. There's no doubt about this. I mean, China has the world's second largest economy if we're looking at it in terms of GDP. It has extremely robust relationships with all of the different ASEAN countries. And actually, in fact, it is usually the #1 trading partner with all of its neighbors around it. So there's no question that China's arrived. Its military power is growing quite dramatically. Its economic linkages with all the different countries throughout all over the world are growing. So there's no doubt that China's arrived. There's no question there.
Okay, Eric, how has it arrived in your mind? Can you put it into a hierarchy? Because, again, we have the American-Asian pivot, and that is, well, it's a military pivot, and they're not shy about it. When you think of China's rise on the global stage, is the military the thing that comes to your mind?
Well, no, quite obviously, China has been used an economic growth model as over the last 20 years, they have grown to what I actually consider to be the world's largest economy, if you measure it in volume terms, a source of 40% of global growth, and a major trading partner, as you said, throughout the region. The military comes later, but every major country ultimately, I mean, the Chinese did not need to have much military because they had no trading lines to protect. They had no supply lines. Now China is intimately linked throughout Asia, but also with Africa and with South America. So at some point, they're concerned with protecting their lines of supply, and that's where Russia comes in.
Okay, Richard, you know, when we look at the great powers of the world, obviously China is one of them. But what is it's the pillar? It's the pillar of its ability to trade? Because we saw during the last financial crisis, or turbulence, as I put it in the introduction, there was a real hiccup there. I mean, is China prepared to lead the global economy if, in fact, it has the largest economy in the world?
In fact, it does not have the largest economy in the world. Purchasing power parity, GDP, which leads to that measure, is actually, in my view, a nonsense concept. But there's no doubt that China has grown spectacularly over the last 30 years, and it has now surpassed Japan in total economic size. And we are seeing worldwide treatment of China. This program itself is an example, very much like the treatment we saw of Japan 25 years ago in the 1980s. So China has not arrived. China has always been there, but China is getting much, much more notice these days for a variety of reasons, not least the performance of the economy, not in the last few months, but in the last 30 years.
Okay, Harry, but do you expect that we'll be talking about China the way we talk about Japan, let's say, in 20 years' time?
I do. I think in terms of economic power and military power, I think China has really grown dramatically. I mean, the reforms that have come in the last 20, 25 years have really put China on a major trajectory to be a world power. I wouldn't say necessarily a superpower. I think that's only a designation you could give to the United States in terms of those respects. But I do think in the next 20, 25 years, we are... Go ahead.
No, Harry, no, good. Let me say with Harry, because he said something really interesting here. I agree with you, when we look at great power and superpower, because there's one element that you didn't really talk about, and it doesn't look like China is really prepared to do it, and it's not to be a great military power. They want to be a great power in every other sense, and I want to talk about being the power or the country of the lender of last resort, which is really important. Is that really that makes China different than the United States? Is the military? Harry, I want to stay with you in Washington. Go ahead.
Sure. I think the important thing that we really need to understand when we talk about China's military is, yes, it has grown dramatically. They have a budget somewhere around between $150 to $170 billion, depending on how you do the math. They have things like carrier killer missiles. They're developing carriers. They have anti-satellite capabilities. So their power is very vast in terms of military capabilities. But we have to keep in mind, and this is a very important point, they are not a global military power yet. They do not have the capability, for example, to deploy large amounts of combat troops to, say, the Middle East or other parts of the world. China has been very focused in terms of making its military power very, very unique to Asia in places like the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. Places that are in what they call its core interests. Okay. And I think that's a very, very important point for people to really understand.
Okay, Eric, I think it's really interesting. I think I know why the Chinese don't want to develop a global military force, because the United States has done it, and it's turned out to be an absolute disaster for the last 15 years. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I'm not a military strategist. I can say, first of all, that China is, by many measures, the world's largest economy. And to use nominal exchange rates is meaningless. You have to look at volumes. You've got to look at volumes, and that puts China, by many measures, at the top. It's not really a horse race right now. It's very clear that with current growth rates, they are going to be the largest by almost any measure. But the military is, in fact, very much concentrated in Asia, because that's where growth is and that's where China's core interests are. However, given the minerals trade with Africa, given the fact that China is the largest trading partner for the likes of Brazil and Argentina, at some point they're going to have to protect those lines too. So I'm not sure if it's very important what is their major geographical focus at present. It has been expanding out because of necessity.
Okay, Richard, let's talk about China's growth model, because it's been extraordinary over the last 40 years. I don't think any of us, when I look at all the faces of the program, would have thought, at least 30 years ago, that China would be so affluent and so rich compared to its origins, and say at the advent of communism in China. Is its growth model exhausted? Does it need a new growth model now? Because I'm thinking about what happened a few weeks ago. That was a real hiccup in their markets, and the world felt it.
Well, I think it's worth keeping in mind, if you go back to the beginning of communism, China just emerged from nearly 2 decades of war, both international war and civil war. It was exceptionally poor at that time, and like Europe right after the war, it had a recovery period in the first decade of communism, until Mao screwed the economy up. And then the reform period started in the late 1970s under Deng Xiaoping, and that's the period that has seen this spectacular growth. It has been driven largely by investment and by exports, and both of those sources of growth, not that they will go down, but as sources of growth, both of those are in serious decline. China's now the world's largest exporting country, can no longer increase its share of world exports significantly, as it did in the 1980s and 1990s, and returns on investment have declined markedly in China. So China needs a significant rebalancing. The Chinese government understands that fully. It's part of their declaratory policy, but they've had significant trouble in executing the rebalancing they've been talking about now for 7 or 8 years.
Harry, one of the interesting things is that, when you look at, exports, global exports have plummeted, and that's one of the a very serious sign for the global economy. But the Chinese don't really have to worry too much about that. They have such a huge domestic market they need to develop anyway. Their consumers there. And as Europe and to some extent the United States, continue this politics of austerity, the Chinese can watch the trade go, not have to go there, because there's not much growth. I mean, the consumers aren't consuming very much. The Chinese will then look inward in a very different way than it did, let's say, a century ago.
Right. No, I think that's true. I think for China, I think the problem is quite clear. I don't think you need to be an economist to see it. The export-led growth model that China's used for the last 20, 30 years to drive its growth, it cannot drive those massive 10% GDP growth numbers year over year. It's just not possible. So I think where China has to go is Chinese consumers really need to step in really trying to really drive this economy forward. But that requires creating a service economy, creating all the different things that really the United States is very good at. And I think that's going to be a very hard challenge for China to really take on. Can they do it? I think it would take a long time. I think the Chinese people would have to get used to a lot lower growth rates, and that could create some instability in China. And I don't know if the leaders in Beijing are willing to risk that. So I think the next 10 or 15 years are going to be quite interesting.
Eric, weigh in. You know Asia pretty well. Go ahead.
If you've been in China recently, you will see that the absent Chinese consumer is all over the place. Shopping in any of the small cities, and by small cities I mean 3 or 4 million people, you will find just throngs. Consumption has become quite popular. It certainly does not have the service infrastructure of the United States or the United Kingdom, but you're getting a lot more service. They're leading the way in a lot of internet stuff. Internet distribution of products is exploding. A lot of the, I think of the Fortune 500 companies, about 100 of them are not Chinese. So there has been at least the beginnings of a transformation. But it's true, it's a 10-year transformation. Their track record has been pretty good till now, but this is a statement of future expectation.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on China. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing China on the world stage. Okay, Richard, I'd like to go back to you in Cambridge. In preparing for this program, I came across an interesting quote from Bloomberg. It goes as the following. In the Chinese century, assuming the 21st century is the Chinese century, bad behavior has its rewards. Of course, that is talking about China's incredibly deep pockets to be able to invest around the world and help out economies like it has Venezuela, for example, China to some degree, and other economies around the world. But its bad behavior has its rewards. So go ahead, Richard. How do you react to that? Because I look at the IMF, and it doesn't always, I don't think of the IMF as a very virtuous organization. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, I'm not sure how you want me to respond. I do think of the IMF. I'm not sure I would use the word virtuous, but I would use the word necessary,
just so you know,
and in its overall effects positive, in the sense that the world would be much worse off without it. Including some of the countries that complain about it and even blame it, because it's easier to blame foreigners always than it is to blame your own officials. But that's a separate topic. I think we're seeing with China what, again, we saw with Japan. It developed rapidly. With the rapid development, it became wealthier, became a major global investor, and it became a major giver of foreign aid.
Sure.
And I'd like to remind people that we created the Asian Development Bank now 50 years ago to use as an outlet for increasing Japanese funding. And I see a similar process going through with China in the next decade or two. The Asian Infrastructure Bank is just an example of a Chinese initiative which can be an outlet for Chinese funds, but they hope to do it cooperatively with other countries and to raise funds also from other countries. So I think China is seeking its place in the international system, and I think that it's good for the world as a whole to make room for China, and I see that many of these developments as actually potentially very positive, not negative.
Okay.
I think we're being a little Pollyannish here.
Go ahead, Eric, jump in.
I think we're being a little Pollyannish here. I think that China has been sort of frozen out of its fair share of the international economic organizations, which were set up by the United States at the end of the Second World War, at a time when it accounted for about half of all global GDP. It's no longer the case, and China is also creating alternatives. From a Russian standpoint, as you know, relations with the West are not currently very friendly. 10 or 20 years ago, this would have been disastrous. Because of the secular rise of China, Russia is not isolated. You cannot be isolated when you're carrying out, large-scale military maneuvers and large economic projects with the world's either largest or second largest economy.
Okay, Harry, China quickly is becoming the lender of last resort, and this is very much, the end of the. I know we've been talking about the world's been talking about the end of the Bretton Woods framework for a while now, but I mean, this is like the last of the last nails in the coffin here, because China does have amazingly deep pockets, and the criticism is its critics saying it wants to export its quote unquote capitalist authoritarian model. I don't see any evidence of that, and plus, the Western institutions do have this conditionality that is, so much in the global South, so much despised. China doesn't have any interest in that, at least apparently at this stage it doesn't. It wants a good rate of return. It's really outdoing the West in terms of capitalism. How do you react to all and any of those things?
Well, I think it's very interesting. China is very realpolitik, very realist in a lot of different ways, especially in its business practices. And I think a good example of this is Chinese interactions in China. Really starting from the very late 1990s until the present day, China in Africa has really done a lot of work in terms of driving loans, driving investments, selling consumer goods, working specifically with Angola and really developing their oil reserves and bringing them back to China. And of course, just like any good businessman, China is going to want to return on its investment. They come with conditions, just like anything. Of course, there's financial conditions. The case with Angola, for example, China did a lot of development work for Angola and requested oil and other resources back in return. Right now, that relationship between China and Africa is extremely robust. I believe it's over something like $100 billion, maybe more. So I think the Chinese are doing what any good country would do in terms of using their economic power and muscle to get the best deals possible. Many countries do this, so I think it's quite normal, to be honest.
Okay, Richard, how do you look at that? I mean, China's engagement of the global economy as opposed to how the West does it.
Well, I would have to disagree strongly with what Eric said earlier. China has discovered in around 1980 and exploited superbly the U.S.-British organized international economic system. China is not a renegade vis-a-vis that system. It is accommodated superbly to it. And I think now China will play its role. Africa is a continent that has been underemphasized, and I think China's emphasis on Africa has, on balance, been a wholesome one. There are, of course, some negatives whenever there are lots of contacts between peoples and lots of money involved. I think the label lender of last resort is extraordinarily misleading as applied to China. That's a term that usually is applied to central banks, and China is certainly not the lender of last resort in that sense. In fact, it did not put up any money during the Asian financial crisis, for example, or sorry, a modest amount, only a modest amount of money. It's
put
true
up a
that
lot of money for Argentina and Venezuela
made loans
recently.
to Venezuela.
Yep. Okay, keep going. Finish up, Richard. Go ahead.
And I think that sitting in the Chinese Ministry of Finance, I'm sure there's a lot of anxiety about those loans to Venezuela.
Okay, Eric, you want to weigh?
I think the notion that China is a status quo power is laughable. I think certainly they have been supporting countries which the United States would have liked to see, let's say, regime change in, to put it politely. Venezuela and Argentina are two which come to mind. Russia is another one. As you know, the Americans have been trying very hard to isolate Russia diplomatically, economically, and politically, and China has been rowing very hard in the opposite direction. So China now has to create its own network of relationships, its own policy diplomacy, and it is an alternative to the Washington model. And I don't think there's an example in history of a major empire rising, or a major country, a major world power rising, to some extent displacing the existing hegemon, and this being an entirely peaceful and friendly process. When the United States displaced the United Kingdom, there was, similar things occurred. It was just a much slower process.
Okay. Harry, in the National Interest a few months ago, I came across an article about the world without the West, and I don't remember the author of it, but it was a superb article. I think it was a series of articles here. And this, again, is one of the reasons why I did this program, because I think it's really smart thinking. Kudos to the National Interest there. But this is, again, the Chinese. I don't see the Chinese are happy. They weren't accommodated in these international institutions, financial institutions. They are, in many ways, creating parallels to Western institutions, depending on the politics of austerity and all the other issues afflicting the Western world. The Chinese are saying, if we can't we can't have a more powerful role, meaningful role, we'll create our own role. We'll have a parallel universe to the West. Is that happening in your mind?
I think in very small steps they are. And I think to go back to the point of China not being a status quo power is a very important point. China is creating a lot of parallel institutions, like we've talked about the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, other institutions in order to invest in other countries, trying to develop different types of relationships, specifically with Russia and other countries, to sort of grow its power. But at the same time, this does create large tensions with the United States.
Yep.
And I would point your viewers to some research that came out from Graham Allison at Harvard University. In 11 of 15 scenarios where a rising power actually met a hegemonic or a great power, there's been war. And I think that's something that we all need to take account when we look at China, and specifically tensions with the United States. This is a very dangerous situation between these two countries, and I think it's great that these countries have very deep economic relationships, but I think this is something we have to watch very carefully.
You know, Richard, and maybe I'd like to ask all three of you this question. I mean, in Western media, you hear this question, dealing with rising China and, China's place in the world, because there will be a lot of scholars that will say Germany came up very, very quickly in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and the international system couldn't accommodate it. But I think it's really interesting. It's not the rise of China, but the relative decline of the West. I'm very critical of American foreign policy. I see it as like a hammer, and all it does is seize nails around the world. And I'm agreeing with Harry, because I think that's where the potential conflict is, as one is rising and the other one is slowly declining. How do you react to that, Richard?
Well, it's fashionable to talk about Germany as the rising power in the late 19th century, and of course we had the disastrous First World War. But the real rising power in the 19th century to challenge Britain was not Germany, it was the United States. And the United States did not go to war with Britain at all. And so I think this look at history turns out to be a very selective one.
Well,
and it's one that
but it wasn't the United States didn't start the war in Europe. I mean, irrespective of the rise of the United States, it wasn't
That is correct, but the United States was the rising power economically,
and the world, it was accommodated.
In the end,
and it was accommodated very well.
And the process was an entirely peaceful one.
Okay. But the point is here is that the international system didn't accommodate, in Europe, Germany, okay? That was the global powers at the time, colonialism. Eric, how do you see that here? Again, because, again, you're looking at, I remember you had this debate with former Ambassador McFaul to Russia.
Yeah, that was rather interesting. It was at the beginning of the last decade, or middle of the last decade, and in an exchange with him, he was at that time a professor at Stanford, he very self-assuredly told me, when I talked about Russia's need to turn towards China, Russia's need for its new Chinese century, that in fact Russia was so afraid of China that they would beg Washington for a military alliance, protective at any price that the Pentagon chose to impose. And I remember that phrase, any price that the Pentagon chose to impose. And now we've seen China, for the first time that I know of in its history, is carrying out large-scale military maneuvers with another country. And that country is Russia. They did large-scale naval maneuvers in the Mediterranean. They're now doing it in the South China Sea. So that prediction was simply falsified.
Okay, I'm going to have to jump in on that point here. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and Cambridge and here in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
believe that this will not continue. I love it.